All right, students, we're going to get into chapter 4. That's human resources in the veterinary practice. This is out of the Elsevier's 4th edition, the practice management for the veterinary team textbook. So to get into and look at human resources is a department that your hospital may or may not have. Your general manager might just be taking over the responsibilities of what human resources do. If you work for a big corporate clinic, they probably will have their own human resources department. But human resources has really big influence on a company, especially with things like organizational behavior, which go into development of the organization and with the employees. So human resources, they are going to have a lot of influence with this company. They're going to be implementing those mission, vision, and value statements that we spoke about previously, which influences the culture and how people behave. And they're also going to have a really big role in employee development because, yes, they're the ones that are interviewing, selecting, hiring, even helping train new employees. And they're going to select employees that help improve the vision, empowerment, and problem solving of the company. And it's essential to the survival of the practice to have good employees coming on board and to have the development go well. And it starts with those correct hiring procedures done by human resources. We are going to get into some acts and laws that you need to be familiar with, and you might already be familiar with these, especially if you've been in the workforce before. These are federal laws that apply to all work settings, not just a veterinary field setting. So we're going to go over that in the next few slides. A lot of different acronyms that we'll be looking at that are also going to be found in your week 2 homework. So laws to be familiar with. The first one that I have listed here is FLSA. That's the Fair Labor and Standards Act. This act will set minimum wage and overtime regulations. They also look at, and you may know this, there is a federal and a state minimum wage, but per the FLSA Act, whatever is the highest rate will supersede the other. So if the state is higher, we use the state. If the federal is higher, we use the federal. The FLSA also requires that most employees are paid hourly versus salary. The people in the hospital that you will see that are paid salary are veterinarians, are doctors, and also usually like administrative assistants and managers are salaried. And this just means that they're going to be paid the same amount of money regardless of the amount of hours that they've worked, which usually means they're going to be doing overtime. But usually their salary is cushioned enough to where it compensates for all of that extra work that might go in. Now, assistants, technicians, receptionists, we're all going to be hourly employees, so paid every hour. FLSA also states that overtime must be paid after 40 hours are accumulated in the same work week. This is a federal law. So again, if you exceed more than 40 hours a week, any more than 40 hours will be considered overtime. Another law to be familiar with is FMLA. This is the Family Medical Leave Act, and this will allow employees up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave for the following reasons. This could be due to incapacity resulting from pregnancy, prenatal medicine care, or childbirth. It could also be to care for the employee's child after birth or placement for adoption or foster care. It could be for the care of an employee's spouse, son, daughter, or parent who has a serious health condition. It can also be used if you yourself has a serious health condition and you're unable to perform your job. So this act, it's really important that you are paying attention to the fact that this act is only good for employees that have been employed with that company for up to a full year. So if you have not worked a full year for the company or around 1,250 hours, you would not qualify for FMLA. It also applies to organizations with 50 plus employees. So if your organization doesn't have that many employees, it might not be applicable. Your workplace might not have medical leave. And be aware, this is unpaid leave. You're not getting paid during this leave. It's saying that we'll give you up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave and they won't fire you for it. But again, there are some stipulations around that. The next one here is the USERRA. This is the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Act. And this is developed to protect individuals enrolled in the military. And it states that we cannot discriminate against previous, current, or future enrollment. So that means that employees have the right to return to their position within the practice once returning from a tour of military duty. And I've seen plenty of people that are in the military and also pursue veterinary medicine. I've seen people go to the military just to get their school paid for so that they could become a technician or a doctor. So we are pretty intricate looped with the military. You'll definitely see people who are servicing in the military that also work in our field. The next one here is the IRCA. This is the Immigration Reform and Control Act, and it just prohibits discrimination against employees for their national origin. So this is a big reason why we have to fill out those I-9 forms. That's what you fill out when you first get hired. And it'll confirm your eligibility to work in the United States. The next one we have here is the Employee Polygraph Protection Act. And this will prohibit most employers from using a lie detector test. It also states that we cannot discriminate against those who refuse to take the test, and we can use it in practices that treat with and dispense controlled substances. Now, the need and actually the odds of going through a polygraph test is really, really low. If you're somebody like me and you're a little bit of a crime junkie, you might know that polygraphs do not hold up in a court of law. They used to, but they don't really anymore. There's not really much of a purpose for using them. Now, with this last line here, we can use in practices that treat and dispense controlled substances. We're going to talk about that in week 4. We'll get into talking about controlled substances, and then you'll learn more about it in your advanced module 102, which talks about pharmacology. But when we deal with controlled substances, these are medications that are locked away for good reason. If there was any type of malpractice there where medication was missing, especially controlled substance medication, that is where it would launch a full-on investigation and where, sure, a lie detector test could definitely be used. The next act that we have listed here is the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, and this will prevent discrimination based on the following factors. So based off of race, color, gender, religion, national origin. And it says that we cannot deny promotion or hiring based on any of the above factors. And it kind of ties into the Civil Rights Act as well. The Civil Rights Act says that we cannot discriminate against potential and current employees based on sexual favors, basically saying we can't pay women less than men for the exact same job. Again, and that comes into gender. We cannot discriminate on promotion, on hiring, on pay for any of those following factors. Now, another thing that is prevalent in veterinary medicine is age. You will see people that are at so many different walks of life that all work in the same field. You'll work with doctors that are well into their 70s. You'll work with people that are fresh out of high school. You'll work with people that have been in the field that are, 40s, 50s. You'll work with everyone. We definitely have a lot of very long range of years that people spend in the field. You can spend your entire life and career in the veterinary field. So the Age Discrimination Act is set in place, and it says that we can't discriminate against potential or current employees over the age of 40 years. This would only be really an issue in our field when it comes to things like lifting animals. If you had to do a lot of heavy lifting and you were older and you couldn't lift very well, that could be a concern. But I have seen so many people work their entire lives in vet med, and we have really fancy tools to help with things like that. We even have tables that are electric that'll move up and down. You don't have to lift any dogs. It's really nice. So Again, it's not something that we see too much in our field because you will be working with so many different people in different walks of life. We don't have to worry about that too much, but it is something to be talked about. All right. So OSHA, we are going to talk about OSHA today. I mentioned OSHA during our previous lecture when we were looking at PPE, which is personal protective equipment. So OSHA, that's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and they are a federal administration that is developed to protect employees in the workplace environment. So OSHA is not just in veterinary medicine, they're everywhere. They're in construction, they're in restaurant work, they're everywhere. They have, again, kind of rights and responsibilities to help protect employees in their workplace. So they will come up with standards and regulations that we have to follow. And then the employer, like your manager, the owner of the clinic, the hospital admin, they have the duty to provide that safe work environment. So they have to abide by all of the standards that OSHA is setting for them. And they have to also provide the PPE, personal protective equipment, to the employees that are determined by OSHA. And employees must also use this personal protective equipment if it is provided by the employer. And we'll talk a little bit more about OSHA later on in the lecture today. And there is another lecture in week 4 where we'll talk more as well. Again, you'll see OSHA everywhere as they really are the main administration that is out there advocating for workers and making sure that we have a safe working environment, especially with those of us that work in high risk fields, which is anything to do with medical, uh, any medical medicine, whether that's human medicine or animal medicine. Another thing that I wanted to address here, which there's no laws necessarily that it has listed here, but with pregnancy, especially in vet med, because we deal with animals and we deal with what we call zoonotic diseases. A zoonotic disease is a disease that can transfer from human to animal and animal to human. So as you can imagine, it can already be high risk, being around animals that could potentially make you sick, and you're even at more high risk when you're pregnant. So we can't discriminate against pregnant women, but we will be modifying their job. It says here that we can't prohibit you from continuing your current position, but we will be modifying it. If you do become pregnant, I strongly encourage you, I don't care who you tell about it, but you should definitely be telling your manager or the doctor that you work with, because we have to keep you and your unborn child safe. You can't be taking radiographs. You can't be taking x-rays. You shouldn't be around the ultrasound machine. You shouldn't be scooping cats' litter boxes. You shouldn't be lifting heavy dogs. There's so many, I want to say, like, smaller parts of our job, because it's overall you can still do. I've seen people work up until their due date, basically, with doing, I would say, like 75% of their job. There's a good 25% of it that pregnant women should stay away from, because there's hazardous chemicals, there's radiation risk, there's again, we don't want them to drop an animal or strain themselves. So there's, of course, certain things that they can't do, and the risk for disease transmission, like cleaning cats' litter boxes. There's a huge risk for toxoplasmosis, which can cause really severe birth defects in children. So just be aware of that. If it happens to you, if you become pregnant, make sure you tell your manager, make sure you tell your doctor who you're working under, so that they can keep you safe, and that we're not having you do and work in parts of the job that could be at high risk for you and your child. So just something to be aware of. Now, there are some required posters. We just went over all of these different laws and acts, and guess what? You can get posters for all of these that we just talked about to put them up in the clinic that you work for. Now, this is going to be, your human resources slash your manager is going to be the one doing this. It's not required. The only one that's required by law is OSHA. You have to have handouts and posters up about OSHA throughout your clinic. All of the other acts that we have listed here that we went over, it's not required, but OSHA, you have to. It's the law. So these posters should be located in a visible location for all employees, usually in like a staff room or by the lockers. And you can pick them up for free at the Department of Labor. You don't have to purchase them. They're available for any employer to pick up from your state's Department of Labor. All right. So now that we've talked about a lot of those pre-hiring laws, acts, things that can affect that, let's get into what kind of your first day is going to look like, a little bit more about training, the manuals and resources that are available for you. So when you are hired, you will receive an employee manual. And an employee manual is essentially like a quick guide for employees. It's going to have all of your resources that you might need and things to know about working in your specific clinic or hospital and what to do if personnel issues arise. So in an employee manual, it'll talk all about things like uniforms, scheduling, benefits. It'll talk about termination procedures and how they go about that. It'll talk about discounts. It'll really kind of encompass anything that you might want to know about your position and really getting into kind of the procedures of that practice. And every practice can be different. So you'll receive a copy on your first day, and usually you'll be required to read through the entire thing on your first day and sign a form indicating that you've received it and you've read through it. They used to be like physical books, like binders. Nowadays, it's kind of all electronic, probably more or less in like a Google Doc that you can have. Again, same thing though, we'll need to read through and sign that you've read through and you've understand it. Now, when your manager slash clinic owner is developing this employee manual, there's a few things to keep in mind with things like creating a positive tone, making sure that you're promoting open communication throughout the manual. And again, topics that are going to be included in this manual are things like the philosophy statements or that mission, vision, and value statement for the practice. Any laws of importance, like the ones that we just talked about. There will also be a very clear definition of full-time versus part-time employment. They're also going to include employment policies like their code of conduct, their appearance or their dress code policy. They'll even talk about things like benefits. This is really important. Benefits are usually available to full-time employees only. And I'm talking about things like vacation leave, PTO, that's paid time off, sick leave, holiday pay, retirement, insurance, continuing education, dues and licenses, employee discounts. Those are all benefits that you can receive as being a full-time employee. Sometimes they'll still give you employee discounts and continuing education. They'll pay for it even when you're part-time. It just depends on their policies. When it comes to benefits, they can give you different retirement plans. I haven't seen this offered very much in the field. I've definitely seen where insurance is offered, but very rarely have I seen retirement plans offered. That could change, of course, but just from my perspective, I've never seen it offered in a veterinary assistant job. But there are different types of retirement plans, and you can always start up your own. But there's IRAs, there's 401ks, there's SEPs. And I recommend doing a little bit of research on that to think about what might be right for you. But insurance should always be offered as a benefit, and that could be different types of insurance like HMO or PPO. A hospital will also have disability and liability insurance on their employees in case anything happens on the job. And they might offer things like vision or dental. Again, it just depends on the benefits that they offer. Some other topics that are going to be included in this employee manual are going to be the drug and alcohol abuse policy. They're also going to have information on their sexual and physiological harassment policy. They're going to have a non-compete agreements. They're going to have information about jury duty, training procedures, safety procedures, probationary period if there is one, and termination procedures. So again, it's kind of a quick guide to go look back and look at all of those rules, regulations, things that are set forward by that clinic. They also will include job descriptions, and job descriptions are going to be very detailed because in these job descriptions, it's going to detail out exactly what you need to be doing in your job role. An assistant is going to be doing different work than a receptionist, than a technician, than a doctor. So everybody has their own specific roles and jobs that they're going to be held accountable for, and it's going to be listed in that job description. So it's really important when you're interviewing, I would ask for that job description and make sure that everything that's listed in there are things that you're comfortable with, and that aligns with the job that you're wanting. And job descriptions, they include hard skill competencies, right? Like drawing blood or restraining an animal, but they also have soft skill competencies, which is your communication. How well do you communicate with clients, and your fellow employees? And again, how are your communication skills? And your job descriptions should match your performance expectations. So again, when you interview, be asking for those job descriptions during that interview phase and make sure that you can do all of the jobs that are listed there. An assistant job at a emergency clinic is going to look very different than a veterinary assistant job at a general practice clinic, and the job descriptions will be completely different. So again, that's something that I would absolutely focus on and do research with before signing on to that job, making sure that it's really something that you're going to be able to commit to. Now, in addition to the employee manual, your manager will also be developing a training protocol, and this is what we would use to train all new employees. Most hospitals implement what's called phase training, which means that you'll teach phase one first, and once they pass and go through phase one, then we'll move on to phase two and so forward. The reason that we like to do it that way is so that we're not overloading employees, especially, within their first few weeks of working at the practice. There's going to be a lot of info, and we don't want to overload them all at one time. So phase training can be really effective for that. Of course, anybody that is training another employee should be somebody with a lot of enthusiasm, be willing to train and have a great attitude. And there's going to be hands-on training for everybody. Kennel assistants get hands-on training. So do veterinary assistants. So do technicians. So do receptionists. Your training period will vary depending on how much you need to be trained with and how vigorous the job is. Usually training lasts for about a month. There is also, again, a procedural manual. So we kind of have three different ones here. We've got you're going to have an employee manual, a training protocol, and then a procedural manual. And I know that's a little bit confusing. So a procedural manual, we also nickname these, they're called tech books. That's kind of what I referred to them to my majority of the time in the field, is again called a tech book. And they will have every procedure used in the practice listed in this manual. So I'm talking about, like, it's going to show you it's going to tell you step by step how to run a blood test. It's going to tell you step by step how to wrap a surgical pack. It'll tell you step by step how to make the concentrated cleaner bottles. It'll have everything. It's like a gold mine of information. Most hospitals have something like this. It's usually in a binder that's been strung together over the years, and it does help to train employees, but it's not the training manual. It's just all of the procedures into one. And it's to be a quick reference as you're doing things, to kind of double check yourself, make sure that you're doing everything correctly. And it should be placed in a central location of the practice where anybody can access it at any time. Nowadays, things are becoming a little bit more digital, probably moving into more of like a computer document, and it's updated often. There is also another set of protocols. I know there's a lot. There is standards of care, also known as SOC, and these are considered to be guidelines and treatment protocols that are developed by the medical team. So they're developed to provide the highest quality of care to every patient and client. It also helps us maintain standard of communication and helping drive client compliance. And the doctors are usually the ones helping formulate the SOC. Okay, so moving away from training manuals, let's talk a little bit about payroll. So, how are you going to be paid? What is it to be expected with your payroll? So, payroll can differ depending on where you are employed. I have seen payroll be weekly, bi-weekly, and semi-monthly. Weekly means that you're paid on a weekly basis. So, like, let's say every Friday is your payday. Bi-weekly would be every 2 weeks you get paid, versus semi-monthly would be twice a month. And no, it's not the same thing as bi-weekly because there are some months of the year where you can be paid 3 times on a bi-weekly schedule. That's why there's 26 payroll periods versus 24, as you can see with the differences there. Most clinics will do a semi-monthly, like on the 1st and on the 15th, for example. Now, payroll can also be a few different factors here. Payroll can be salary, right, for our employees, like our doctors or our managers, where they're paid a base amount every single time. It doesn't change regardless of the hours that they've worked. You could be an hourly employee, which is going to be all of you. So assistants, receptionists, technicians, they're all hourly. So you're paid a wage on an hourly basis. You're paid based on how many hours you work. There are also our production-based employees, and these are, I'm talking about your doctors, because they're the ones that are going to be selling products and promoting products. And some companies will give extra compensation for selling and promoting their products. So usually doctors are actually a pro-sal combination because they're paid salary, but they also get production bonuses based off of products that they sell. So let's go into some examples of what a salary would look like versus what an hourly employee would look like. We'll break down the math here for a few minutes just so that you can get a good idea of, again, what those different types of pay look like. So for this salary example, let's say that we have a veterinarian they're paid salary, but they don't have a production bonus. And the salary for the year is 60,000 and the pay period is biweekly. So how would you calculate about how much you're going to make? Well, what you would need to do for this is you would need to take your amount that you're going to make per year, which is 60,000. You would divide that by how many payroll periods you have in a year. And if it's biweekly, you're going to have 26. Go back here and we double check that, 26. And that means that it's going to be roughly $2,307.69 per pay period before taxes. And every state tax is different. So you're going to be taxed differently in California than you would be in Hawaii, than you would be in Washington. It's all going to be different taxes. So it's hard to say how much would be deducted from that. But again, that's just an easy way to kind of calculate around what would that rough estimate be. Now, if we were doing hourly examples, we'd have to look at how much we're paid per hour and how many hours we're working per week. So we'll look at a few examples here. So we have Sam is paid $15 an hour and works 20 hours per week. The pay period is bi-weekly. So again, if working $15 per hour, work 20 hours per week. So we would need to take that $15 and multiply it by that 20 hours. And that's about $300. Now they did this per week and the pay period is bi-weekly, which means it's every 2 weeks. So we do have to multiply that by 2 because that's for 2 weeks, which means that this employee will have made $600 per pay period before taxes. In this second example, same thing. We have Aiden is paid $10 per hour and works 32 hours per week. The pay period is biweekly. So if they made $10 an hour, worked 32 hours, we would multiply that together to get $320, times it by 2 because it's biweekly, and it would be about $640 per pay period. So again, you can do this on your own when you start working to kind of help you calculate about how much you're going to make. But again, do remember that every state tax is different and how much they tax, and even in different counties and areas are different. Now, if you worked and did some overtime, which will happen, let's break down what that would look like. So in this scenario, Alex works 40 hours in week 1 and 45 hours in week 2, and we know that anything above 40 hours a week is considered overtime. He is paid $10 per hour and is paid biweekly. So again, we would do the math. $10 per hour times 40 hours for both week 1 and week 2, so $400 per week. And then we have to do the overtime pay. So overtime pay is usually time and a half, which means that it would be $10 plus half of that $10. So it would be $15 an hour per every overtime hour. Multiply that by the 5 hours they did in overtime, and you get 75 extra. So their check would be $875 before taxes. Now, your human resources / your manager will have to keep and maintain your employee records and your payroll records. They do have to do this for a specified amount of years, and it does vary by the state. I believe California is 5 years. Any of this information that's personal like that has to be kept in a locked and secured cabinet, usually within the manager's office. Team members will receive payroll stubs for each pay period. Some of these are printed out payroll stubs, others they do it online, so it just kind of depends. The most common method for getting you your money on your payday is to do direct deposit. A lot of companies do this, which is just the method of depositing their payroll check directly into your bank account automatically. It's really, really nice. So on payday, you check your account and it's already uploaded into your bank account. You don't have to grab a physical check and go do it yourself. This is really beneficial because it saves time and it decreases costs to the practice because they're not having to print out paper checks. It decreases human error and it saves paper. So it's all around a really great thing. And pretty much every clinic that I've ever worked at has offered it. Okay, before we get more into taxes, we are coming up around our break time. So we are going to go on a break. I will pause the recording. All right, class, welcome back from your break. So we're going to keep on going, just pick up where we left off. We were looking at payroll, the difference between a salary employee versus an hourly, and addressing how to calculate that, as well as looking at direct deposit and routes of being paid. So now we're going to be addressing taxes. So you will pay payroll taxes. Both the practice that you work for and you as an employee will pay these taxes. The employer will withhold the tax from your paycheck, and you're going to see everything. It's going to be broken down on your pay stub. So you're going to see where it says things like, taking out for Social Security or Medicare or state tax versus federal tax. In California, they even have like a roads tax. So you'll see a complete breakdown of that on your pay stub. And again, your employer will also be paying taxes even before they pay you in regards to this as well. Now, payroll taxes, these are paid to the IRS through a federal tax deposit, also known as FTD. And taxes are paid monthly or semi-weekly. Just depends on how much of the amount of tax is due. And again, who's responsible for this would be your human resources or your manager. They'll be dealing with all of the financials and making sure the taxes are paid on time, because if they are not paid on time, if they are late, there can be a severe penalty, usually a financial, like a fine. And it can be a pretty hefty fine. Oh, excuse me, everybody. Oh my gosh. Feel like I'm getting some spring allergies as it's coming around. It's sneaking up on me. Okay, so let's look at now a little bit more about taxes, but this is important with unemployment taxes. So there is something called FUTA. This is the Federal Unemployment Tax Act, and it's paid by your employer. So there are taxes on the first $7,000 paid to the employee. They pay these quarterly. It says in your PowerPoint here that not all states have an unemployment program, but post-pandemic, pretty much every state has options with their unemployment programs, and they're a lot more developed than they used to be. Of course, qualifications for this vary. It depends on your work situation and various different reasons will qualify for unemployment. Like during the pandemic, we saw massive um, work just being stopped, right? You had work one day, didn't have work the next day, and it wasn't anybody's fault that that happened. So there was a lot of unemployment being given to many different people, essentially anybody that wasn't an essential employee during the time. Regular unemployment, it does vary. Usually you have to be laid off by your work or fired to be qualified. If you quit your job, you might not necessarily qualify for unemployment. So doing your research in your own state is important. And it also depends on how long you've been working there too. When we're getting into taxes, you will be filling out a lot of forms on your first few days, and a W-4 form is a part of one of those forms. And these are filled out again, first day on the job, usually when you get hired. And your W-4 indicates the amount of deductions to be withheld from your check. So that this has to do with, you would be putting on your W-4 and claiming if you're married, if you have dependents, and all of that will put you into different tax brackets. So making sure that you're doing that correctly is really important. On this W-4 form, you're also going to be putting your name, social security, and signature. So there's sensitive information on these forms. They're also going to be kept in that locked cabinet in your manager's office. Every employee will have a file where their information is filed in. Now, W-2 forms are the forms that get sent out to the employees, and they are a summary of payroll for the preceding year. So, for example, we're in the midst of tax season right now. Tax season is up until April 15th. And so employers are required to send you your tax forms no later than January 31st. And then you have to file your own taxes by April 15th. And there's many different ways that you can do your personal taxes. You can have a tax official do it for you. You can use free filing services online. It just has to be filed for your personal taxes. Coming back to that personnel file. So your manager will have a file cabinet that's locked that will have a file that will have files in there for every single employee. And these files will include your resume, your W-4 form, your benefits form, emergency contact information, your I-9 form, which is your eligibility to work in the United States, medical records, and medical records would really only pertain to if you got hurt on the job, then they would have a copy of those medical records of getting that care and using workman's compensation. And they say that you have to keep these records for a minimum of 7 years, even after the employee has left the practice, but it varies by state. I'm pretty sure California is right around the 5 year mark. And again, because this is case sensitive information, have to keep it locked, have to keep it in a monitored office, usually that's going to even have a camera in the office as well, because again, your socials, all of your sensitive information is in this locked cabinet. To break down some employee differences, we're going to look at like a regular employee versus a contract employee where you would see them in the field. A regular employee could be an hourly or a salary-based employee. These are people that are hired permanently, which means when you're hired basically indefinitely until somebody, whether the employer or the employee, terminates the contract, right? So with a regular employee, both the team member and the employer will be paying taxes, payroll taxes, and the practice that you work for must ensure that they're in compliance with the IRS code for any contract employees. And again, if they're doing this incorrectly, pretty serious fines can happen if they're in violation. They can be issued to pay these fines that can be a pretty hefty amount. So a big part of your manager's job is dealing with money and payroll. That's a lot of what they're doing, in addition to interviewing and training and hiring employees, managing the team. Now, when it comes to hiring the perfect team, we were discussing this in our earlier lectures, the difference between like hard skills versus soft skills and what do we look for, and good qualities to have, especially with leadership traits. And it comes true too when it comes down to interviewing. And as somebody who I've interviewed quite a bit, been an interviewer, especially in this teaching job that I have right now, I've interviewed quite a bit for our program, for other instructors, and for the school. And it's so true. When it comes down to hiring somebody, I look at things like your soft skills because I can teach you a hard skill. I can teach you how to restrain an animal. I can teach you how to use this computer. I can teach you how to run this laboratory test, but I can't teach your personality and I can't teach you to have hard work ethic. That's a soft skill. That's something that comes from within. You have to put on that good personality and you have to work hard. I can't teach you to do those things if you don't want to, right? So unmotivated, irritable team members, they're considered to be contagious and unproductive, and I don't want them on my team. So your human resources slash your management is going to be working really hard to make sure that they're hiring people that have great soft skills. I would, I mean, to put it into perspective for you, I would rather hire somebody who, as a veterinary assistant, I would rather hire someone who's fresh out of school that has no experience, but a great personality, a great attitude. I would rather hire them over the assistant that's been doing it for 20 years, but has a really bad attitude and have a hard time getting along with. Just because you have the medical experience and you have those hard skills doesn't mean that you're going to supersede somebody that doesn't. So just be aware of that. Your soft skills matter a lot and are something that you should be working on a daily basis for professional and personal growth. Now, when should a hospital hire people? You should hire when certain things start to happen, like medical errors. If your team starts making errors, if customers start being unhappy, if your workers start being unhappy and maybe have a decreased work-life balance because they're working too much, those would all be reasons to hire. They also might go off of a model, saying like maybe they want 4 or maybe 5 employees per full-time employed doctor of veterinary medicine. So per veterinarian, maybe they want 4 or 5 team members, depending on the size of the practice. And that includes, maybe like 1 receptionist, 1 assistant, 1 technician, whatever that is, per doctor. So we will look at things like that as well, to see what's going to help make the practice be the most successful. But usually, if things start to decrease, things aren't going well, that means we definitely need to hire, especially if the workload is increasing. When your manager is looking at people to hire, they will look and review the resumes that are submitted, and they'll also review your cover letter and any letters of reference. We don't really do much of letters of reference anymore. You might need a letter of reference if you're applying for a school or continuing education and stuff, but when it comes to applying for jobs, usually you'll be asked for a reference list. a list of references that that employer can call. It's not a bad idea to have a letter of reference, but again, just know that it's much more common for them to just ask you for, like, for example, three references that they can call to vouch for you. When it comes to your resumes, this is exactly why you're doing them in this class, is because you are going to be creating your resume and cover letter, because you are going to be using those when you apply for jobs, right? So you're going to be submitting this in addition to the application. And then the potential manager is going to be then reviewing those and then possibly scheduling an interview. To minimize any claims of discrimination in hiring procedures, the manager needs to be really careful and make sure that they review the resume with the same technique. So basically doing the same thing every single time. So this also applies for interviews. Don't be put off if, you know, you're going through an interview and they're asking you the right, like all of the same questions that they're asking somebody else. They're also going to be asking the references all the same questions. So it might seem really generic, like they're just asking generic questions, and but it's meant to be that way. They're not supposed to favor somebody more than another person, even in as early of the hiring process as the interview. We are not allowed to treat one applicant differently than another. So when it comes to asking those questions, we want to ask like open-ended questions. So you all are going through that right now in your labs. You're practicing these interview questions and you're getting to see some mock examples and activities that you're going through. And a lot of these questions are going to ask you to talk about yourself and talk about your journey and why you want to be working in the field and what led you there and your why and purpose and where's your goals, where you want to be. So start thinking about those questions and how you would answer them. I also recommend that you ask for a working interview. Now, most hospitals will invite you to come for a working interview, but if they don't, please ask for one. I personally would never take a job in the field unless I had a working interview. And the reason for that is because I need to know how this hospital operates and if I'm going to be a good fit for this workplace. I don't want to take this job and then show up my first week and then realize I'm not meant for this job and have to quit and then go through it all again. I don't want to do that. So a working interview, it's really common in the veterinary field. Usually it's about 2 hours and you'll go to that hospital. Not all working interviews are paid. A lot of them are unpaid. And it's really for you to get the scope of the practice. It's so that you can go in there and you can see how everybody works with one another, the speed of everything, and you can see, is this going to be a good fit for you or not? I've definitely been saved by a working interview before where, you know, I sat down with the manager and did that interview, the formal interview, and it went great. And I thought, oh my gosh, this place is going to be amazing. It sounds so wonderful. And I went in for a working interview and it was awful. Everyone was running around like crazy. There was a lot of disrespect and just not cohesiveness. People weren't working together. And I realized why they were so urgently hiring. So take it from me, I highly recommend it. Spending an hour or two of your life to make sure that it's a good working environment for you to spend 40 hours of it a week is important. And a clinic might look great and shiny and beautiful, and the manager might make it out to seem like it's the best place and fit for you. And then you go and you show up and it's not a great fit at all. So I recommend to take that short time to do it to make sure that you're making the right choice about your employment. Highly recommend. Some clinics will require you to do it too because they want to know how you would work with their team. So just know that it is something that usually happens, and I would do it regardless if they offered it or not. Now, when it comes to the interview, there are going to be questions that they're not allowed to ask you. So these are things to be aware of. If you're ever asked about any of these following topics, just know that you are not obligated to answer these questions. And if anything, it would give me a little bit of a red flag with that workplace. You know, if they're asking you about very personal things like anything listed here, you know, that's testing boundaries, that's getting into discriminatory factors. Again, not supposed to be asking you about things like marital status. They're not supposed to ask you how old you are. They're not supposed to ask you about your gender, national origin, religious affiliations, holidays observed, military status, children. They're not allowed to ask you about that. But if you decide to just disclose it to them, that's on you. So for example, if they asked you what your availability was like, what is your availability or works, or, for working going to be like, and you let them know, well, I can do, I can work 8 to 2, but I have to, pick up my kids after school at 2:30, so I'd have to be out by 2. They didn't ask you if you had children, but right there with your answer, you just disclosed that you did. So should you do that? That's your own discretion. Just know that they're not allowed to ask you about it, and they're not allowed to discriminate and not hire you because of it. So I would be careful with what you do disclose. And again, just remember, you don't have to disclose anything in regards to any of these topics. In addition to the interview and working interview, they might also do a pre-employment screening. And this consists of doing like a background check. And most states usually require this. However, it kind of depends. Some states do like local reports, others do national reports. If it's a local report, it'll only pick up violations in that current state, versus national reports will pick up anywhere within the US. Usually it's just a local report that's going to be ran if they do one. They also might do administer in-house testing, meaning they might sit you down and have you do a test, like a grammar or a spelling or a terminology or a typing test before they give you an offer, because they want to make sure that you can talk the talk, but you can walk the walk, right? You can talk about your schooling, but can you actually demonstrate that you absorbed what you were learning? So just know that when I was first and fresh out of school, I did quite a few of these in-house testings at the places that I worked at, because they wanted to make sure that I, being graduated from a program, am actually ready to work, and to go straight into their practice. Now, coming back to the subject of a contract employee versus a regular employee. So we looked at a regular employee, right? That could be an hourly or a salary. It's like a permanently hired employee. A contract employee is generally like a relief employee, meaning they're just coming in to do relief work for a veterinarian or for a technician. They're not permanently hired employees. Um, they basically do coverage, or, covering for other people while they're out. And this also can include groomers who maybe just come in like once a week to do certain clients, and they're contracted to the hospital, right? They don't work out of the hospital full time, but they do have a contract with them. So anybody that's contracted to work there is going to be paid a straight fee, and the hospital won't be deducting any taxes. The employee that's contracted is responsible for doing their own taxes and paying their own. And they also have to file what's called a MISC 1099, which is basically like an independent contractor file form, tax form that has to be filled out if you're a contract. And again, this is usually just relief veterinarians, and groomers kind of fall into this category. When it comes to your first day, once you're hired, what your first day is going to look like is you'll be given a tour of the hospital. You're going to be introduced to all of the team members. You'll fill out all of your first day paperwork. You'll review the policy and procedures, procedural manual, all of that. Most of the time, they'll take the new employees to lunch, or they'll make sure that you have lunch with people, with some of the team members. Um, the whole goal of the first day is we try not to overwhelm you on your first day. We want it to be welcoming and easy and mellow, and more of discussing what the next training phase and everything will look like for you. When it comes to team training, again, we usually put our staff members into what's called phase training, and it's so that we don't overwhelm them. phase training is great because they finish phase one before they go to phase two. And then, same thing. They got to finish the current phase that they're on before going on to the next one. So it does a really great job of not overwhelming people when they're going through training. Um, we'll also be using a training protocol to ensure that all team members are receiving the same exact training. So we'll have, again, that going back to that training manual, we will be using that with every single new employee and training the same exact way. Even if it's different people doing the training, if we're all training off of the same manual and using the same stuff, we should be doing it the same way. It should ensure that everybody gets the same exact training. And again, there's going to be multiple people training you. It's not just going to be one person the entire time. They actually encourage that all team members participate in training. And a big reason for that is there's a lot of, it's communication methods. One person might explain a procedure differently than another, and it could allow you to understand it better. So again, this is why it's really great to kind of mix up who's training you. And you're gonna see this. I've said this saying before, and it's there's a million methods to the madness. And it's very true. There's a million methods usually to do one exact thing. So just be aware that there's many tasks that can be completed in more than one way. And new team members should be shown all of the ways to complete a task. So kind of like how I showed y'all with the typing test, right? You could submit it by putting it onto a Google Doc, or you could save it on your desktop and submit it that way. I showed you both of the ways that you could do it, but I allowed you to do it whatever way you wanted to. In the end, it got done and it was completed, but you had the choice of doing what method was easier for you. In training scenarios, we'll do a lot of role play. So we'll act out fake scenarios and situations to give you the opportunity to practice. So things like practicing educating clients, practicing taking histories, and doing all aspects of our job, especially with client communications. Even things like answering phones, doing reception type duties, making appointments. We'll all be doing kind of role play type situations with that. And it's one of the best ways to learn, honestly, before you start working with real clients, when it gets a little bit more scary at first. You will get well acquainted with your coworkers before that. And don't worry, you'll get tons of time to shadow and watch people do it before you're then the one going to be performing those responsibilities. Now, when it comes to staff retention, this is something that any employer should be very well aware of. And what can we do to keep our employees happy, to keep them working for this current employer, and decreasing employee turnover? So, methods to retain employees are as followed. Adequate training for all team members, making sure we're all trained in the same way is also very important. Having mutual respect for one another, giving recognition when it's due, and also honoring people's achievements, providing challenges for employees, kind of stimulate them, get them to want to do more, accomplish more, learn more, delegating those responsibilities to the appropriate employees, doing succession or goal planning, and giving performance reviews. All of those absolutely play a really big role in the overall success of a practice, how happy their workers are, and more likely, again, if they're happier, they're going to stay longer. You are going to retain your employees longer. And that's the ultimate goal, is to have very, very low employee turnover. That's how you know it's a really great clinic. People don't want to leave. Additional methods to retain employees include providing a safe work environment for them, providing an environment that promotes open communication, providing a team, right? So being able to work together as a team, having that respect, having that trust. Also doing things like team member surveys to kind of test the waters, see how everybody's doing. And this could also be addressed during staff meetings, helping resolve conflicts and solving these problems together. And of course, how much are you being paid? right? Are you getting adequate raises? Do you feel like you're fairly compensated with your salary? When we retain team members, when they stay at the practice for a long amount of time, it increases so many different factors, and for the better. It increases things like the average client transaction. We're able to bond and establish these bonds with clients and with the patients, right? We're going to get to know them a lot better, especially if you've been working there for years and years. You are going to know your clients. You're going to be very well established. You're also going to be established in your team. It's going to increase that team feeling because you've been working together for a long time. It also increases the commitment the team has to the practice. They're going to be very dedicated to their place of work. And again, producing a really safe and happy work environment when that's what everybody's looking for. Another great thing to do to retain team members is to provide continuing education for the entire team. And continuing education, it's not just for doctors, it's not just for technicians, it's for everybody in the clinic. And it's to, again, update everybody on the new happenings in the veterinary field because we're constantly forever changing, improving, getting better. We need to make sure that we're keeping up to date on diseases, treatments, medications. So we should be attending seminars or conferences or doing online courses or even having manufacturer representatives come in and do what we call like a lunch and learn at our clinic. And we can learn about their new products and services. Continuing education will inspire and encourage learning and develops skills. It's a fantastic way to do team building and keep people motivated. And it is required for doctoral and technician licenses. They have to do them every single year to keep them active. Again, it's not required for receptionists or assistants, but it's still really important for us to participate in the continuing education. Last subject that we're going to talk about today for human resources is looking at termination procedures. So what would happen if you were terminated, and how would that play out? So when it comes to termination, this procedure is going to be clearly outlined in your employee manual. There will be a whole section in your manual that goes over what happens and what leads up to termination. Termination usually takes time, meaning, like, for example, a clinic could have a policy where, like, we'll give you one verbal warning and 3 written warnings before you are going to be terminated. Warnings, when given, are usually going to include methods of correction. So it's going to state like what you did wrong and what you need to do to correct this. It's usually going to be done in the form of a meeting. Everything has to be documented and signed by both the manager and the employee afterwards. And again, if a third warning happens, then usually termination will follow that. Most employers will give their employees multiple chances, again, multiple warnings. We don't just want to fire people right away. We want to give them chances. You know, people make mistakes. It happens. But it's all about the correction. It's all about what you do from that mistake. So don't get discouraged if you get a verbal warning or even if you get a written warning. It happens. It's not the end of the world. The best thing that you can do from this is do better. Look at the methods of correction and correct what happened. Make sure it doesn't happen again. And they will help you. Usually they're going to make sure that people are following up with you and that we're following the correct procedures. They're really going to help to try to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And again, termination, it's going to be a result when policy is not correctly followed. So we have to make sure that we are correctly following it. We also, if we do have to terminate an employee, we should never do it when someone's upset because it shouldn't be like a big fight, argue, blowout. It really should be a formal sit down meeting, talking about it, signing paperwork, and doing it the right way. And once termination has been warranted, they say that time and procedure are of essence because if the employee has things like a door key, which most do when you work at a veterinary clinic, if you're opening or closing, you're going to have keys to the building. Maybe you have uniforms that are from that practice and things like that. So usually if we are going to terminate an employee, it's going to be in a sit down, formal, neutral environment to where we can then issue them their last paycheck and they can give us back our keys and materials. And we try to make it as smooth going as possible as we can. The employee usually also has to sign termination paperwork, which will indicate the reason of termination, which you would need if you were going to apply for unemployment. So keep that in mind. And everything has to be documented. It's going to go in the employee's record. And again, that could be useful for terms of unemployment or things in the future for you as well. All right. With that being said, class, that is everything for chapter 4. So we are all done. That is the end for chapter 4, human resources in the veterinary practice.